Hey, what's up, Liron here. In today's video, I want to show you how to preserve the colorfulness and saturation of a painting without getting it to be overworked, too dull, and so on. I got this idea actually from one of my recent cars in my challenge, 100 cars challenge, which I was very happy with, and kind of gotten back to my colorful, saturated roots. And so today I'm going to demonstrate this one for you, and we'll really see the point where it's good to stop. We've established most of the interest and beauty in the scene. There's no need to go overboard and overwork. So if you're going to enjoy this one, let's get to it. So as always, you will find a picture of the sketching stage in the description box. I did not film it. Now, what I'm doing here is, to everyone who says that you have to clean up the palette or you can't use saturated colors, here I go using this yellow ochre straight from the pan and also mixing it up a bit on the palette and really not cleaning the well, and it still works fine because if the paint, if you dig enough, it will get back to being saturated. But let's zoom out a little and talk a bit about the goal with this process. So I'm kind of going to my very saturated roots in a way, which I love. I love doing this kind of a thing. I barely mix my colors on the palette. What I do is basically take them from the well and onto the paper. My goal here is to create an initial wash that is basically as colorful and as saturated as possible, because that's going to be the final layer for many parts of this painting. So we're establishing almost everything here. So one big thing to have in mind is connections. I'm basically dividing the painting into two, the light and shadow, and I'm taking everything that's in what I define as shadows, and I'm using strong saturated colors to define those areas. Now what this is going to lead to is an impression of three-dimensionality and light and shadow. Why? Because we're dividing the scene into light and dark. Now, during this initial wash, other than just painting over all the areas that are in the shadow, we also want to establish some wet in wets so that we can save up work down the line. So instead of waiting for this to dry and then putting another layer and running the risk of, again, losing that saturation and getting it to look dull and muddy, we're going to try and get as much done on the first layer, and then we're going to use the next layer just to establish some focal points. Okay, so the second layer is more of a compositional means rather than actually needing to darken something up. So talking about connections, here we go. I connect the background with that beautiful shadow casting on the car. And you can see it in the reference photo. It's just a lovely scene. It's a scene where the sunlight is fairly strong, so you get very light highlights, very clear shadows. This is the perfect reference in a way. Now, it may be a bit of a complex drawing, and that's fine. You may want to avoid it for that reason. But in terms of light and shadow, it's actually quite a good one to paint. Now, I want to switch it up and add a bit more red, because so far we've had yellow and blue, which created green for the background and its foliage. So here we go red for the main front shield of the car, windshield, and to that I'm kind of playing around with the saturation. So I used both something that's more Quinacridone Rosy, and then I also added a bit more of a strongly saturated red. And look at how much beauty this already has. Now, the shapes are still unclear, undefined, because we still have not established everything. But you will see once we establish everything, this will turn into a beautiful, beautiful three-dimensional impression. Now, the tricky part is in the shadows just to figure out where to place the shapes and where to leave it white. What should I skip? What highlights should I leave? And the highlights here aren't small. It's big areas, like this entire front part of the car is in the light, the roof of the car is in the light, the mirrors are in the light, all sorts of shapes are in the light. And you really want to be careful regarding what highlights you leave, because these are going to attract the viewer's attention. So you want to do it strategically in interesting places and in places that, you know, don't overthink it. Look at a reference photo. If you see a spot where, and by the way, I blended this edge here, don't overthink it. If you see a spot that is very light and it stands out to you, go ahead and keep that as a highlight, okay? Now I'm going over the roof of the car, and slowly you see how the shape starts to come together. Now, the beautiful part about watercolor is you let it flow, let it do what it does. Look at how wet this wash is. Let it mix together in an interesting way. Let the paint do what it does best, and don't worry about being extremely accurate here. All I care about really is it a dark shape or is it a light shape? I love doing these kinds of works. Within the shadows, you have some flexibility. It's going to be very hard to darken it too much as long as you keep the wash fairly flowy and wet. So you don't have to worry as much about values, is what I'm trying to say. Even if you are feeling worried about it, just know that you don't have to, because they're going to kind of take care of themselves as long as there's enough movement, okay? But it is important to make that connection now at this stage, okay? Now, onto the cast shadow by the car and by the different details, I'm going a little cooler. So unlike the front of the car, it's fairly yellow and warm, it's strong. Here I'm going with a stronger blue. Now the side, that step in the sidewalk is a little warm because there's a red and white color there, so I went a little warmer. But for the most part, the shadowy area you'll see is going to be strong blue. Now remember what I said, we're going to try and get as many of the darks in this wash, and it's going to be a fairly high key painting. So what I'm doing here is putting as much as I can wet in wet. So you see me placing in that beautiful phthalo blue, and starting to figure out where the shadows are. Now, when I first put this paint, I'm like, okay, this is way too dark. It's much darker than the rest of the area, so I'm kind of screwed. But then you'll see me slowly helping the paint spread out a bit, darkening some more of that right side of the car to make sure that the tires don't feel like they stand out too much. Plus, remember, it's going to dry lighter, and that's a big key to remember. So this means that these strong contrasts that appear very strong right now are going to be a little dumbed down later on. Now I'm looking for areas where I do notice some dark sections where I can start putting in that paint. Now, one tip that arose in the last live stream session is, remember, if you don't want to get cauliflowers and you want to continue being able to do wet and wet, try always having thicker paint in your brush compared to the paper. Okay, that's the key here. Because if you're going to come back to the paper with paint that is wetter than what you have on the paper, it's going to spread out and create these cauliflowers. The wetness is going to push the pigment out and lead to these weird marks, which, by the way, can be beautiful depending on how you use them. If you try to avoid them, be sure to come back with a thicker paint on the brush, and you can really see this if you look at my palette. And I always remind my students, look at the palette while I mix. It's even more important than what's going on the paper. Okay, look at how much paint I'm using, how much water I'm using. Look at the consistency, figure out how I'm doing that, and the things that happen on paper are quite secondary to that. Okay, so for example, now I'm gonna soon mix probably a value, and I'm using the water sprayer to help the paint move a bit. Okay, picking back some paint up to not have it as dark and as highly contrasted with what I already have on paper. Because remember, I have no choice. I have to use thick paint if I want it to properly stay and leave its mark. Now, obviously everything dried. You saw me cutting through it fast. Now everything is dry, and we're continuing with the second wash. Okay, it's very important. I let it dry. Now this second wash is purely for adding focal points. So for example, the windshield seems to be pretty significant and a bit darker than what I initially created it, so I'm going darker with it. Now I then realize it's a bit too dark, it feels a little out of place, so what I'm going to do is add a bit more water to it. I'm going to use my water sprayer to make it a little lighter. I'm going to do all sorts of manipulations on it to help it get a little lighter, okay? And then I'm going to move on and start establishing some of the windows to the side of the car, connecting them to the windshield, because remember, connections are still at play. And you want things to still look very connected together to create that beautiful togetherness and feeling of it's all flowing together. You get that beautiful watercolor feeling, which is our goal here. Preserve saturation and preserve that flow and looseness in a way. Have control in certain areas. And I want you to notice how beautiful it is when you have shapes that have sharp edges but with blurry transitions within them. So if you look at, for example, the front of the car. The front of the car has very well-defined shapes of light and shadow. You get mostly hard transitions from light to dark. But within the dark shapes, look at all of the blurry edges. Look at the yellow connected with blended with some of that beautiful gray, the blue of the tire on the right. All of these things play a role together, okay? Within these shapes, there is a lot of flow. And you want to make sure that this wash that we're placing in right now does not overpower that flow. So we have to be very, very gentle. What I'm establishing is just what is a must to get some focal points, to get some interest, to bring out some details that I find interesting personally. Remember, a lot of this process is what you personally find interesting. A lot of it is subjective. Whenever people ask me, why do you do it this way? Why do you do it that way? Well, it's subjective. It's because I wanted to do it. Because I wanted to. Why did I use yellow and green and blue for the background? Because those are the colors that I wanted to use to represent the foliage. And by the way, notice I haven't even talked about like the colors in that regard. Notice what happens when I'm just using 3 primary colors. It makes everything much more homogeneous in a way. The green really responds well to the blue and yellow and even red. I really limited my palette here. It's 3 primary colors plus maybe an added red. So basically Quinacridone Rose, yellow ochre, and this kind of a phthalo-ish blue, but also a bit of that pyrrole scarlety red, the warmer red. And everything you see comes from these 3 colors. So I am using very saturated colors, but I'm generally using few colors. Okay, so you don't have to go overboard if you have that 24 color palette, you know. Don't go crazy with it. It can be quite confusing in a way. It leads to overthinking. You could make a decision to use just every color in your palette and freely, and that can work too. It's less of my style, so I decided not to do it here. Look at this shape. Now I'm blending this left edge because I want it to be interesting. I don't want the shape to be all around just hard edges. Kind of like that recent video in which I showed you how to create interesting shapes. It's very important for me that this shape that is kind of standalone. It's in the middle of the front of the car. I don't want it to have just well-defined edges all around it. I want a part of it to be sharp and then another part to be a little more blended. That's what's going to lead ultimately to a good, interesting balance. Look at this shadow. I made it stronger, but I don't want to pull it all the way to the right and to the tires and start having a big mess of blending tons of edges, turning everything into more, what do you call it, dull and muddy. So I stop it there. I just blended the edge of that shape. And now I'm kind of thinking about my next move, considering it. I think if I compare this painting to the other one that I showed you, and I will show you later up close, I think with that one I did a bit of a better job, which is to be expected. I was a little more spontaneous, off camera. I just did things based on instinct. I think the color harmony is a little more well organized. I think the color selection and where I place them works a little better. With that, I do think this one works really nicely. Okay, I do think this works really well, and there's this sense of strong sunlight, which is the thing I really wanted to chase with these 2 paintings. Now, I noticed that there's a bit of a shadowy part in one of both tires, but one of them really called for it. I really wanted to better define it. And so this is what I'm doing. I'm creating that shape of the darker sections within it. Okay, so basically darkening it, and I'm still treating it as one big shape. I'm not painting all of the screws on the plates. I'm not doing like a bunch of small details and all of the zigzaggy patterns on the tire, the pattern that helps the grip of the tire, I assume. I treat it as one shape still. Okay, look at the windshield, one shape. Look at the license plate, it's one shape. Look at the shadow under the car, it's still one shape. The more you can do that, the cleaner of a message you can convey to the viewer. Look at these 2 small lines now. How much interest and kind of information they added. Look at this very dim shadow on the headlight on the left side, which is the right side of the car, but it's to our left. Look at how it made the shape of that front, the headlight, feel very prominent. You can feel its roundness. You can feel its softness of smooth kind of transition from light to dark, because I used the edge of the side of the brush rather, to get this kind of a nice blended look. Okay, now I'm mixing quite a dark paint because I want to establish that car on the right. Why? Only because I want to make the car on the front pop. That's the only reason. If you look at around the car now, it's pretty well defined on the left, not really much on the right, and it felt like it would be a good balancing act. Now, I'm not just going to stop this dark shape. I'm going to
I think, try and balance it with the bottom. Yes, so I'm going to add some shadows to the bottom under the car. I don't remember if I'll blend the edges of that shape. Looking back at it, I do want to. Oh yeah, so here we go. I remember it correctly. Because I didn't want it to pop too much. So look at this nice blended edge. Now, if it looks a little messy to you, if you take a few steps back or squint your eyes, you will see. It's kind of a nice blended transition from the back glass of the car onto just the bottom part of the car and the tail light. Because I want that part still to stay in the background as much as possible. It's all means to make the front of the car pop. Now I'm adding this beautiful, beautiful shadow under that mirror. So what do we have here, basically? We have one layer that establishes like 85% of the painting using freely using saturated colors, lots of blues, yellows, reds, greens in a fun way. In a way that, for me personally, to me is very fun. And I keep forgetting this, that I really enjoy this kind of a thing. So I need to remind myself. I don't enjoy muted color schemes as much very often. Sometimes I like the subtlety in yellows, but that's mostly it. I'd much rather see some saturated colors, and I have to remind myself that every once in a while, that I greatly enjoy painting this way, exaggerating the colors. And also we have an interpretation of the shapes, so everything is connected, everything looks good, everything works together, the shapes are blended together, there is a clarity in them. Nothing is overworked. There isn't too many individual small shapes here. Like, how many shapes are in this painting? The background that connects to this beautiful cat's shadow on the front of the car. Then you have the windshield that connects to the entirety of the side of the body of the car and also to that front shadow. It's easy on the eyes. And if you take a few steps back, it's highly realistic, I would claim. And it has this beautiful kind of, it's funny to say, but divine quality almost. It's almost a divine quality in the light. The light and shadow are very, very felt because of that preserved saturation. And I will show you now a comparison between the two results after we remove the tape. So here we go, look at the beautiful borders around it. And this is really has a nice effect because we painted all around it. It's not just a single object in the middle of the frame. And after that, I'm going to show you a comparison of the two cars. I think there is something divine and the light expressed there, and it's one of those things that I really want to express more of. And by the way, the fact that the shadows are slightly more muted than the background really helps with that. So you do have some very clear blue where the tire is and some very clear darker areas, but a lot of the shadows are a little more of a mix between the blue and the red and everything. So in any case, here's the previous one that I think I did a slightly better job, but still in both of these, I really hope you enjoyed this process. Now let's wrap it up.
So once again, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Here are the two recent cars. Here I really was able to nail, I think, the values and temperature. And here I did a really good job. There's a strong sense of light. Obviously, the placement of the colors could always be improved, but I am very happy with this one. And yeah, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the process as well. And if you do want to paint like this, if you haven't checked out my frustration-free watercolor course, be sure to check it out. Link in the description box below. Currently at a discount. I think you're going to really enjoy this one. Let me know in a comment down below what more you'd like me to show in a future video, in a future tutorial. I'm always getting these ideas from you. And also leave a like if you enjoyed this video. It helps it get to more people. Thank you so much. We'll see you again in the next vid.